So here's a problem for you, outsider art. I have titled my talk a bit oddly, I confess. Oddly, at least for a scholarly or collegiate setting like this one. But I do so in order to suggest that this talk will not be an academic one, strictly speaking, or one in the conventional sense. This talk will be more by way of a conversational foray, a way of talking about one of my current life obsessions, so-called outsider art, and the curious concatenation of thoughts, emotions, pleasures, and disquiets it raises in me. Perhaps what I say here will lead to some future scholarly exposition, but this isn't it yet. Here, instead, a problem for you. Outsider art, its nature and provenance, and a short history of the way it has become a problem for me, something that I love and collect, and I love to see and think about, but which also induces in me a sort of cognitive and spiritual dissonance, an ethical uncanniness, if you like, if not some fairly deep dilemmas of mind, heart, and soul. First things first, however, what is outsider art? I'm assuming that some of you may be familiar with the term, others not at all. The name itself turns out to be a controversial one. The definition proffered by the great god Wiki, at whose altar we now all worship, happens to be quite brilliantly concise and to the point here. The term outsider art, invented by Roger Cardinal in 1972, an English synonym for art brut, meaning raw art, rough art, a label created by Jean Dubuffet to describe art created outside the boundaries of official culture, insane asylum inmates. The term, since the time of Dufay, has become applied more broadly to include certain self-taught or naive art makers who were not institutionalized. Typically, those labeled as outsider artists have little or no connection with the mainstream art world. In many cases, their works are only discovered after their deaths. Often, outsider art illustrates extreme mental states, unconventional ideas, or elaborate fantasy worlds. I'll just show you a very quick array here of samples of outsider art. Some of these are from my own collection, such as this one, and others are ones I've gleaned different places. Hope you can see that one, the sense of space being a little peculiar. Andrew Lee. And Dolasek. Good one for a linguist, that one. Mary Belknap, yeah. Yeah, and this is one of my own. It's a photograph that had a layer, a transparency put over it, and then the artist went to work with a marker and whiteout and stuff, I think. So it's also very close to where I live in San Francisco, so I like it for that reason. Yet the proliferating, somewhat vague, cross-linguistic nomenclature here also suggests the difficulty art critics, in particular, have had making sense of the phenomenon anthropologically and or aesthetically. Thus, we get all these terms: art brew, raw art, naive art, the art of the self-taught, the art of the untrained, art by those outside the mainstream, the art of the institutionalized, but likewise, confusingly, art by some of the non-institutionalized, a group one might call the non-institutionalized, but nevertheless very strange. The wiki authors seem here to be thinking of, among others, Henry Darger, the obsessive, reclusive, quasi-pedophilic Chicago hospital janitor and bona fide outsider art genius who died in 1974, leaving behind hundreds of extraordinary scrolls of artwork, exquisitely painted and collaged, depicting an apocalyptic conflict, Homeric in scope, between the Vivian girls, heroic little girls, often shown naked and with penises, tiny ones, and evil male marauders on horseback known as the Glandelians. To this panoply of possible terms, one might in turn add others: visionary art, intuitive art, art from the margins, unofficial art, and so on. Several long-established, broad art historical labels, folk art, vernacular art, popular art, would likewise seem to have some relevance to the topic. Finally, to judge by its urban San Francisco incarnation, the one I know best, outsider art has recently developed some fascinating semantic and subcultural connections with what is known locally as alternative, urban primitive, or indie arts and crafts. Think of those peculiar handmade objects you can find on Etsy.com, hand-knitted goth punk creation, crucifixion scenes, Duchampian hats made out of recycled toilet plungers, bubble wrap, mittens, and the like. I'm making these up. And so on. So, indie art. Yet despite this cluster of interrelated terms, I have to say I think the modernist painter Dubuffet, originator of the Art Brut label, had the conceptual emphasis right, that outsider art is best defined as art produced by those who, if not officially classed as insane or institutionalized, are in some way mentally and socially estranged from, well, the rest of us. Yes, to speak colloquially and empirically here, I mean the mad, the crazy, the unhinged, the non-compos mentis, the people politely known as having psychological deficits. A definition that excludes the element of mental alienation fails to get at something central, I believe, in the phenomenon. Thus, the term folk art is not, in my view, a particularly accurate translation of outsider art, precisely because so much material conventionally described and marketed as folk art, shaker furniture, pewter milk jugs, hand-stitched quilts, early American weather vanes, and the like, was made by apparently rational human beings fully integrated into their usually settled and rural communities. However imaginatively or artistically produced, moreover, such artifacts originally served some homely practical function, some utilitarian purpose. Consider the celebrated case of the women of Gee's Bend, revered members of a small African-American township in Alabama, who across the 20th century and over several generations developed a kind of brilliant geometric, intensely chromatic style of quilt making. Their exquisite creations have been compared justifiably with hard-edge paintings by Malevich, Mondrian, Sol LeWitt, and other 20th century modernist icons. Museum curators exhibit them and produce scholarly tomes about them, and at this point, a host of sophisticated, well-heeled, ineffably bourgeois collectors and cognoscenti have cornered the market on the objects themselves, resulting in skyrocketing prices. But despite their lack of formal education, the Gee's Bend quilters are not themselves, obviously, an alienated, isolated, or mentally unsound crew of ladies. On the contrary, for all their quasi-high modernist chic, their tradition is a calm, collective, and communicative one, nurturing, almost grandmotherly, reassuringly sane. To put another way, the term folk art conveys, to me at least, an idea of polish clarity, and finished smoothness, a kind of neatness and respectability, aesthetically foreign, one might venture, to the outsider mode. They lack entirely those unnerving intimations of entropy and menace and disaster, of failed psychic hygiene, metaphysical anxiety, and disquieting fanaticism present in so many outsider images and artifacts. Other labels displease for similar reasons. When applied to outsider figures like Henry Darger, politically correct descriptors, such as self-taught or untrained, seem at once too fast and loose, and more than a little euphemistic and sentimental. Fast and loose because they risk opening up the potential canon of outsider art, somewhat comically, to artistically unschooled violon d'ingres types like D.H. Lawrence, Arnold Schoenberg, Winston Churchill, and Prince Charles. Talented amateur painters, to be sure, but not exactly what you would call marginal or psychically alienated figures, possibly Prince Charles, but anyway, euphemistic in turn, because once again, the sheer intransigence of outsider art, its blankness, nihilism, incommunicativeness, what you might call its autism, the refusal or inability of the artist to follow normative social and psychological codes, is soft-pedaled. What makes Henry Darger as creative consciousness different from Lawrence, Schoenberg, and the like is precisely what requires understanding. Where did I get all these tendentious opinions? My own engagement with outsider art looks to me now to have been invisible. The coming to fruition of a childhood fixation on the strange and bizarre, and in particular, strange and bizarre pictures. My mother was an artist, and she had this great book. When I remember looking at it when I was about 4 or 5. The paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, and particularly the Garden of Earthly Delights, were just mesmerizing to me at the age of 4. Winnie the Pooh, it wasn't. At a somewhat later stage, I remember watching a documentary in high school, this would have been during the late 60s, about art made by schizophrenics. What I recall best from the film were the magnificently whacked out illustrations of Louis Wain, a hugely popular British artist who, after a successful international career as an illustrator and cartoonist, spent the last 24 years of his life in an insane asylum. Wain specialized in comic illustrations of cats, and scores of his cat postcards, cartoons, and children's books can still be found on eBay. And they've become incredibly expensive. Now, while witty and whimsical, Wain's cats live in a happily cat-centric universe, walk on 2 legs, wear fashionable clothes, though not so much in this one, and behave like unusually antic and accident-prone human beings. The earliest Wain felines maintain some indexical connection with real-world cats. Like Degas or Mary Cassatt, Wain could draw a perfectly normal-looking cat when he wanted to, at least for a while. But over time, one senses something strange happening. The anthropomorphized expressions become more and more intense, bug-eyed, and oddly sinister, notably when the feline subject is shown smiling. Colors and backgrounds get more febrile and abstract, and especially when rendering Persians and Angoras and other long-haired breeds, Wain begins to show his cats with fur brushed up as if full of static electricity. The effect is often so marked that in some images, the pointed tufts of fur seem to create a kind of jagged, phantasmagoric aura, or one that overwhelms the picture space. In the psychedelic quadrant of images shown here, read from top left to bottom right, one can see this development in an almost stop-action way. An animation from Bedlam Studios, perhaps. If once a quaint, if eccentric insider, Wayne seems here to morph into outsider artist before our very eyes. Now, one characteristic that many outsider artists share is an aversion to blank space, a horror vacui, a manic compulsion to fill every inch of the available surface with some kind of coloring or mark. Seeing pictures by Wayne no doubt prepared me for this obsessive mark-making. The worked-over supports tendency toward hypnotic patterning and distorted and ambiguous figure-ground relationships that one finds in one important strand of outsider art. You might call Wayne's mad style a version of outsider art in its paranoid or maximalist mode. It's as if one needs protection, and this protection is best achieved by the filling in to absolute repletion of the image. Obviously, the creation of such imagery takes a great deal of time and requires thousands of small repetitive actions with brush or pencil or tool. Yet one can imagine how well such a practice might itself serve a victim of mental agitation as a form of superstitious magic, as self-soothing or self-medication. Which isn't to say, by the way, that some important outsider artists don't have the contrary tendency. Some, like the San Francisco artist Jimmy Miles, incline, by contrast, to a sort of dry, coolly minimalist practice in which white space is not only tolerated, but an essential, if seriously off-kilter, aesthetic feature in its own right. I'm not sure what the opposite of a paranoid style would be here. Maybe a kind of scary blankness or emptiness, an austere comfort in the diagrammatic, stick figurish, or toothpick-like, a predilection for imagining oneself and others as tiny, generic, and off-center. But in both cases, Wayne and Miles, it is safe to say, I think, that we, the viewers, find ourselves looking into a world in which to our eyes has something not right about it. Just so, whether suggestive of frenzy or emptiness, some roiling tumult in the brain or its opposite, the outsider image takes us to a lonely and impossible place, one to which, in the end, we seem to have only the skimpiest emotional access. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, my growing predilection for outsider art coincided with a growing awareness and discussion of the phenomenon in American culture at large. In Europe, where thanks to Jean Dubuffet, the links between the outsider phenomenon, modernist art, and the aesthetics of the avant-garde had been noted early on, the discussion was already fairly well advanced. In 1921, the Swiss Dr. Walter Morgenthaler published a celebrated book called A Psychiatric Patient as Artist about the case of Adolf Wölfli, a Swiss psychotic subject to terrifying hallucinations, incarcerated at the Waldau Clinic, a mental asylum, for violent sex crimes in 1895. Once sequestered much of the time in solitary confinement, Wölfli spent the rest of his life until his death in 1930, obsessively making drawings, bejeweled, fantastical, arcane ones, sometimes containing his own odd musical notations, using colored pencils and paper donated by the doctor and his colleagues. The interest in outsider art arose, however, somewhat later in the US, not really until the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. In those decades, several major American outsider artists were, as it were, discovered and feted with important exhibitions, most of which I managed to see. And you have to realize that until then, the mainstream art world, even in its avant-garde manifestations, had either ignored outsider artists or viewed them with distaste. Yet thanks, I think, to a growing public interest in alternative visual phenomena of all kinds, vernacular styles, minority artists, a certain postmodern de-skilling, the aesthetic status of the outsider work began to rise. Exhibitions of outsider art took place, remarkably enough, with increasing frequency in major museums and galleries. Dealers sprang up to capitalize on the new interest. The New York Outsider Art Fair, an annual event, began in 1993. Among the first of these discoveries to be celebrated, and still one of my own favorite outsider figures, was A.G. Rizzoli, a shy San Francisco architectural draftsman who lived his entire life with his mother. They shared a bedroom, and as they say in the catalog, he died a virgin. His work consists of astonishingly detailed drawings of Beaux-Arts, fantasy buildings, lofty, airy, neo-Gothic cathedral-like. These he labeled symbolic representations of specific human beings. Each picture, it seemed, was meant to signify his veneration of the person thus commemorated. Among the human subjects transmogrified into these emblematic buildings were Rizzoli's mother, as here, certain friends of the family, the odd San Francisco civic leader or politician, and touchingly, various children from Rizzoli's neighborhood who liked to visit him and watch him draw. Oops, where's the one from, I lost the one to Shirley Bursey. Oh, it was the first one, obviously, Shirley's Temple. Anyway, most of Rizzoli's drawings include captions and other pieces of text, and invariably rendered in beautiful hand-drawn lettering, often reminiscent of early 20th century municipal signage and fancy printing. Rizzoli liked to make his images look official. The early ones often bear a little corporate-looking emblem or artist logo with the initials ATE, meaning, according to Rizzoli, whose first name was Achille Tectonic Exhibit. Later, he introduced another municipal-sounding acronym, YTTE. The initials stood for Yield to Total Elation. Indeed, for the outsider world, there's an unusual tenderness and humor in Rizzoli, occasionally almost morphing into sociability, which combined with the gorgeous architecture yields something jazzy and exquisite, even at times sublime. Though the aforementioned Henry Darger's creative work had been known by his neighbors, at least, since just before his death in 1973, and was subsequently safely extracted from the squalid junk piled up in his tiny Chicago apartment upon his demise, Darger, too, orphan, recluse, janitor, and visionary creator on an epic scale, the Michelangelo, if you like, of outsider art, might likewise be considered a discovery of the 1990s. The first big show of his work I saw was in 1996, and not long after, the poet John Ashbery, inspired by Darger, published a book-length poem entitled Girls on the Run, the cover of which bore an arresting Darger watercolor showing some of the Vivian girls in panic-stricken flight. The literariness and epic virtual world quality in Henry Darger's work, effects intensified by his use of tracings, collage, hand-scrawled text, and comic strip elements, makes him particularly fascinating to writers. Darger himself might be called an outsider writer as well as an outsider artist. Along with the long panoramic double-sided scrolls depicting the Vivian girls' struggle against the barbaric Glandelians, Darger also left behind almost 20,000 pages of autobiographical writing and texts relating to the melodramatic incidents he had illustrated. Some of this material has subsequently been gathered together under the title In the Realms of the Unreal, the name also given to an absorbing documentary made about Darger in 2005. Whoops, go back there, sorry. It must be acknowledged that the now global recognition Darger's work has received, he has just been the subject of a massive, elegant catalog and exhibit at MoMA in New York, the Museum of Modern Art, has no doubt to do with his work's noirish mixture of extraordinary delicacy with creepy subject matter, visual loveliness with grisly scenes of violence and perversion. Once seen, his pale, shockingly uncensored pictures are never forgotten. He was clearly fixated on macabre themes involving children, witnessed the multiple gory images in his oeuvre depicting mutilation, evisceration, fires and explosions, and in particular, death by strangulation or throttling, the punishment of choice visited on the rebellious Vivian girls by their brutal Glandelian persecutors. There we go. In a recent essay about Darger, one critic has suggested fairly chillingly that had Darger not channeled these sadistic fantasies into art, he might have been one of the most prolific serial killers in history, no doubt with a particular relish for child murder. One feels slightly effete pointing it out, especially amid such putative pathology, that Darger, like William Blake, is also one of the most subtle and enchanting colorists in the history of figurative art. Even his most horrific images are rendered, indeed, with such delicate refinement of hue and color gradation. One feels almost ashamed to notice it, but one does. Over the past 10 or 15 years, other outsider artists have likewise been canonized. Bill Traylor, one of the most compelling of the African-American outsider artists. Nellie Mae Rowe, I love this picture, a sort of altered photograph. Edgar Tolson. Lee Godey, a Chicago bag lady and street person who painted and made weird, altered portraits of herself using the photo booth camera in train and subway stations. James Castle, no relation that I know of, a severely retarded deaf-mute man from Idaho whose large rural family cared for him his whole life. He lived in a trailer on their farm, and who before his death in 1977 made thousands of drawings, books, and small sculptures using scrap paper, cardboard, and string, and a mixture of soot and saliva for ink. Some kind of critical milestone was reached in turn about 3 or 4 years ago with the rediscovery of Martin Ramirez, an indigent Mexican laborer who came to California for work in 1925 and ended up in a series of psychiatric hospitals for more than 30 years. Despite Ramirez's frightening diagnosis of catatonic schizophrenia, and after a certain point he never spoke or responded to language, he drew constantly, producing large hypnotic images on brown paper bags or donated rolls of examining table paper of the type you see in doctors' offices. His characteristic subjects include arid-looking Mexican landscapes and hills, often with train tunnels and trains coming through them, horseback riders, deer, Madonnas, horses. The critical milestone to which I refer was a breathtaking review in 2007 of his work, in which Roberta Smith, the longtime senior art critic at the New York Times, declared Ramirez quite simply, quote, one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. She writes, Ramirez had an indelible style, built on a supreme sense of economy and shot through with a mix of sly humor and sunny optimism that coats deeper, darker feelings. He had his own way with materials and color, buoyed by an unerring sensitivity to the power of blank paper, and a cast of unforgettable characters, including mounted caballeros, levitating Madonnas, and deer and dogs on high alert. But most of all, Ramirez had his own brand of pictorial space, which he regulated with rhythmic systems of parallel lines, curved and straight. He played spatial illusion as if it were an accordion, expanding and contracting it in a mesmerizing play of stasis and movement. Unquote. If such a paean represents contemporary art world legitimation, however belated, that one would be hard-pressed to beat, it also thrills because I can't help but feel that Roberta Smith was right. All to the good then, this ongoing cultural validation for outsider artists. But you'll recall that at the outset of my talk, I spoke of my interest in such art as a problem for me, that despite my fascination, despite the fact individual works bring me extraordinary visual pleasure, and I've become myself a collector of such works, the phenomenon nevertheless evokes in me a certain ambivalence, a paradoxical push-pull feeling state, an uneasy love-hate reaction. This state of affairs, I confess, has been greatly intensified by my recent encounters with Creativity Explored, a nonprofit combined gallery studio space in San Francisco for artists with developmental disabilities of one sort or another. The disabilities include Down syndrome, autism, mutism, schizophrenia, a number of other biogenetic frailties, usually in combination with some form of impaired physical function. Admission into the program is not open to anyone. The place is restricted to disabled adults with a demonstrable gift in art, and though people do come and go, the population remains constant at around 30 artists. Some artists have been there for a decade or more, others not so long. Highly dedicated staff of volunteer artists and art teachers lead the participants in constantly changing projects in a variety of media. All supplies are donated. Every month or so, there is a show at the gallery at which art made by the artist is for sale, the profit going to the individual artist, most of whom live with their families or in group homes and are otherwise unable to support themselves. The gallery is open to the public most days, and on weekdays, when the artists are there and working, one can see through a door of the gallery into the huge adjoining studio space at the back, a massive light-filled warehouse space the size of a basketball court, filled with people of all shapes, sizes, and ethnicities. A deafening cacophony emerges from the studio, squeals, laughter, brash cries, along with an ongoing childish burble and roar of voices. It sounds like a kindergarten on steroids. During the Christmas show and other fundraising events, one can go into the studio oneself and rifle through the great bins of recently created art, or contemplate the vast piles of images spread out on work tables or thumbtacked onto walls, all for sale. Prices for individual works depend mainly on size and range from $5 to around $150. I have been known to emerge from such events carrying off armloads of stuff. I spell out the layout and economics of the place because part of my unease has to do with my experience of collecting outsider art. I first visited the studio during one of the Christmas fairs, an experience I can only compare with Aladdin discovering his cave. Now, I should note that despite having no formal training or any traditional skills such as draftsmanship, I make art myself, usually collage, either the old-fashioned cut paper kind or digital. As someone who struggles, often haplessly, to create something of at least passing value, I was staggered by the freedom joy, profusion, and utter fearlessness of the works I saw. The gigantic, airy space was itself part of the effect. Awash in color and excitement, it was like entering a liberating dream. I wanted to go home and drag out all my glue and paper scraps and start collaging, so to speak, like mad. And yet to use words like fearlessness, however, is to assume a kind of normative psychology, if not an outright intentionality, that may not in fact be relevant to the artists themselves. In a terrific recent book looking at outsider art, Lyle Rexer has commented on the fact that most outsider artists, especially the most compulsive and mentally isolated, seem to feel little connection with the work they make after it is produced. There is no sense of possession, of that look what I've made feeling, of having an oeuvre or body of work, or adding to one's personal storehouse of completed projects. The process of creation itself is the be-all and end-all, the product of virtually no account. One might attribute this lack of authorial investment to the fact that, for whatever reason, many outsider artists have no deeply internalized sense of an audience, and some have none at all. Thus, the work that looks fearless to me is nothing of the sort. It is not so much that the artist has triumphed over some inhibition or hesitation prompted by the thought of someone later judging the work. The work looks the way it does, releases its astonishingly profligate energy and life precisely because the artist, arguably, either does not recognize or understand the idea of being judged, or indeed the concept of judgment itself. There is simply no one there to fear. For many outsider artists, the catatonic Martin Ramirez say would be a compelling case. The making of the artwork would seem, in fact, to be utterly unmediated by social relationships or the neuroses that result therefrom. Which is another way of saying the outsider work is not a statement addressed to a viewer. It is not rhetorical, nor meant as communication. It is not produced to impress or seduce or charm. Paradoxically enough, this incommunicativeness can register with the viewer even when the artist uses language as a primary part of his or her creative process. One of the artists of creativity explored that I collect is John Patrick Mckenzie, whose pictures are from one angle repetitious in the extreme. Mckenzie takes any surface he can, usually white foam core, and prints a stream of words across it using a black marker. He has his own idiosyncratic, instantly recognizable style of lettermaking. He methodically fills in the negative space in any letter form, having what type designers call a closed counter, A, B, E, G, some examples. Now, it's true that his inscriptions sometimes hint at message making, but the repetitions work against any kind of literal-minded transmission of meaning. At times, he fixates completely on sentences, seemingly unself-consciously and incomprehensibly. This is not Gertrude Stein consciously challenging conventional English syntax, playing with grammar, making it strange on purpose. It is Mckenzie, mute, compulsive, and unapproachable, soothing his odd automaton soul through some primitive synchronization of the motor control part of the brain with the obviously damaged part devoted to language. This apparent lack of rhetorical intent, the premium falling instead on compulsive productivity, as if one had to keep drawing or writing or splashing paint around, or else one would fall off some kind of psychic ledge, means that the work of the individual outsider artist do not usually show any artistic development over time or exhibit any recognition on the part of the artist that some of his or her creations might be better than others. One of the guilty pleasures that I have taken in outsider art, in fact, has been developing my own sorting process, a kind of impromptu rogue connoisseurship honed by my interest in contemporary art, by which I separate the things I find good from the things I think are bad. And there are a lot of interesting marketing issues here. In the case of outsider art, one is typically confronted with a pile of similar works, all marked at the same low price, say $10, and it is up to the collector with his or her magical questing eye to extract the one jewel from the dross. I confess that some of my own greatest collecting moments occur when I uncover what I call an accidental masterpiece, an outsider work, which in a way obviously unintended by the artist, reminds me of the work of some much sought after, highly prized contemporary major modern artist. Thus, I have become adept, in my own mind at least, at landing on accidental Rauschenbergs, Cy Twombly's, Joan Mitchell's. I mean, this one blows my mind. Accidental works by Eva Hesse or Louise Bourgeois, or there's Pollock to give you the contrast, Richard Tuttle or Jean-Marie Basquiat. At such moments, one feels one has not only gotten something compelling, but one has somehow also exposed the artificially inflated prices of the official art world, the whole pretentious and absurd economy of top-tier dealers, curators, biennials, and collectors. How valuable can an Eva Hesse or Richard Tuttle construction be if the outsider artist James Castle accidentally managed to do something similar using cast-off bits of cardboard in a trailer in Idaho? And yes, I admit it, I enjoy a perverse feeling of triumph when an art-savvy friend says of some piece, "Oh, whose work is that?" expecting me to name some at least minor mainstream art world figure. It always seems to me that I'm getting away with something, that the piece I've cannily, if not slyly picked out, is in fact a steal. I just want to show you the Agnes Martin drawing here compared with Andalusek. This would be worth $2 to $3 million, this drawing. His artwork, $250? I don't know, the prices are going up. As well it may be, for at the very same time, the outsider artist's lack of possessiveness, just, excuse me just one second, the lack of possessiveness, his or her seeming lack of interest in the economic fate of any piece, and once in the creativity explored bins, the outsider works, though named on the back, often no longer seem to belong to anybody. This imparts its own ethical dilemmas. Even if one has paid for a piece, as I have myself discovered in moments of self-critical chagrin, one is less likely to feel an obligation, perhaps, to credit the creator of the piece for his or her contribution. I am embarrassed to say, feel slightly guilty, in fact, to admit that in various collages that I've made, I've sometimes incorporated little digitally scanned bits and pieces of some of the outsider works I've accumulated to serve as background or a Photoshop layer to be blended with others. Am I engaging in a kind of artistic larceny by such appropriation, any more than I would be were I using, for example, a clipping from a magazine or sales brochure brochure, or newspaper. I recently published a book with one of my collages on the cover. The publisher, sensibly wary, for suddenly one was in the realm of copyrights and contracts and potentially out of control litigiousness, required that I obtain permission for every element making up the image, including the original photograph of blue floral wallpaper I used for the background. And I did have some examples of these. Yes, this is an outsider wood carving that, for some reason, I've just been fascinated by this face, and I have used it in my own work. I guess my rule of thumb is I try to make it so that I am the only person who would possibly note the connection, that it has to be manipulated in such a way that I am the only one who might know of or see the original inspiration. Now this one, I think, on the right doesn't pass the test, but what I did there is Photoshop in the face of Bernini's Saint Teresa. Okay. Perhaps my moral quandaries will become moot soon enough, for the popular and critical recognition accruing to outsider art over the past decade or so has meant that just like any other attractive or intriguing cultural product one might name, outsider art has been commercialized, and not just by suddenly rapacious dealers. A large and intricate Rizzoli drawing can now cost as much as $200,000, and Darger's works have long been far beyond the reach of the ordinary collector. One is now competing with museum directors and the edgier sort of hedge fund manager or Silicon Valley CEO. Creativity Explored, though nonprofit, has begun a process of licensing work by its artists, there it is, to companies so as to increase sales and, one imagines, create a larger audience for outsider art, and indeed to bring it into a kind of economic parity with the rest of the art market. The most recent foray is an arrangement with the urban design retailer CB2, a subsidiary of Crate & Barrel, which is now offering its customers pillows, rugs, and other decorative items imprinted with designs by Creativity Explored artists. I suppose this is a good development, though one wonders exactly how much such marketing benefits the artists, and indeed if other parties, starting with the Creativity Explored Board of Trustees and the organization's full-time employees, do not now have an increasingly dubious stake in this money-making venture. The authors of the Creativity website are vague on the subject of income derived from corporate tie-ins and appear oblivious to the possibility that their artists or their families might be vulnerable to exploitation by their corporate handlers. And this is what it says on the website. All CB2 products include artist signatures and are accompanied by a hang tag with a brief bio of the artist. And best of all, a percentage of each sale of these products will go directly, not to the artist, to Creativity Explored. So a kind of ambiguity has entered into the situation. Though perhaps I romanticize the situation in a way condescending to the artist, I can't help but feel perhaps that a certain innocence has been lost, even if the outsider artist won't or cannot attach any commodity value to his or her work. It seems that more and more people are willing to do that, just that, on his or her behalf. I'm coming to the end of my remarks here, and I'm going to show you a poem. I won't read it all, by the poet Kay Ryan, one of the, I think, greatest living American poets. She was the poet laureate of the United States in, I think, 2009, and so on. She wrote this poem. It appears in her collection, The Best of It. And you'll get the drift here. She shares this discomfort, I would say, that I experience, the attraction and what is also truly a kind of repulsion. We are not pleased the way we thought we would be pleased. Ryan lands here on several things that strike a chord. I find I share her dislike of, almost a revulsion at times, at outsider art, for instance, in which a religious theme is central. I really can't bear it. Works such as Howard Finster or Sister Gertrude Morgan's apocalyptic visions of Jesus and the angels, inevitably decorated with fanatic scrawlings from Scripture, the whole sadomasochistic, baptized in the blood of the Lamb thing. You're not my usual audience, Kansas, so I'm probably going to be stoned after this, in the bad sense. I am sure that this is because I'm not a religious person, if not an out-and-out anti-clericalist. I believe all religions to be compensatory, consolatory human fictions. If my own definition of outsider art goes something like this, then, that it is art made by strangers of some absolute kind, persons permanently estranged from me, who live in a different world than I do, then religious outsiders seem to me like strangers to the nth degree. But at the same time, I have to confess that as for Ryan, a certain subtle displeasure is always present, lurking, as you might say, in my response to all of the art, that is, not just what I think of as the religious fanatics. Even when I hear myself saying, oh, I'm so fascinated by this picture, I love this artist, isn't this amazing? I know there is invariably some element of bad faith in my assertion, because there is something in it, again, all of it, that I very much don't like. Now, what draws me in with outsider art, I've concluded, is nothing less than the possibility, the bait of meaning. I've been a lifelong sucker for meaning, you could say, a sort of meaning junkie. Above all, I want other human beings to communicate with me, to tell me what they mean. If the meaning they impart seems incomplete, mysterious, convoluted, paradoxical, ironic in form, unresolved, I become upset and frustrated and want to know what they mean all the more. Hence, a lifetime spent as a college literature professor, as a sort of meaning broker. I began teaching literature because great works of literature always seemed like puzzles to me. I needed to solve each one. I need to get to the bottom of this. I have a hard time with incoherence, with cognitive dissonance. They make me anxious. But inevitably, precisely what draws me in, the meaning bait, is precisely what shuts me out. At a certain time, my interest in any given work will, so to speak, go dead. I find I have simply given up on trying to parse it in any conventional way. It never answers my questions. It is a disturbing fact that a great deal of outsider art doesn't wear well in the colloquial idiom. One tires of it. It fails to reveal its secrets. A certain depth effect seems lacking. And one may develop, indeed, an outright aversion to the piece, a form of aesthetic, or is it hermeneutic, animosity and displeasure. I cherish the work of one creativity artist explored in particular, Peter Cordova. He is one of the more seemingly communicative, able, and presentable artists. He is always brought out at Meet the Artist fundraisers held by the organization, though he doesn't exactly converse with anyone. He simply hovers. He even has apparently a little part-time job as a bagger at a Safeway store. His work is repetitious, like that of all the creativity explored artists, but within that spectrum, he has a number of different motifs. He does portraits of people, animals and plants, in particular, complicated images featuring Native Americans, teepees, women with papooses, and so on. Not long ago, I bought for $25, an extraordinary yet also seemingly anomalous picture he had made of Wotan, the one-eyed father of the gods in Wagner's Ring Cycle. Or is it the young hero Siegfried. Cordova has given his subject the eye patch traditionally sported by Wotan, but has written Richard Wagner Siegfried at the bottom of the image. You won't be able to see that. But can one ask him who it is meant to be? Does he know the story of the ring? Has he seen the opera? Or just the billboards advertising the San Francisco opera version coming this summer? I've tried to speak to him now and then on such topics, but he remains mute with me on this and all other subjects, and indeed, I am not pleased the way I thought I would be pleased. Thank you.